Workplace discrimination, community violence, murder of loved ones, incarceration, police violence, distressing medical experiences, ethnic cleansing and persecution, immigration difficulties, deportation, destruction of cultural practices. Can you guess what each of these have in common? Well, they are all distressing events that can contribute to racial trauma. Now, you may be curious about the title of this video. What does racial trauma have to do with psychedelics? What's IFS and how is it involved? In this video, we'll explore the relationship between racial trauma, psychedelics, and IFS. But first, what is racial trauma? Also referred to as race-based trauma, racial trauma refers to experiences related to threats, prejudice, harm, shame, humiliation, and guilt associated with various types of racial discrimination, either for direct victims or witnesses. This type of trauma is cumulative, meaning that it can build over time and across individual, institutional, and systemic levels. In this way, it's similar to complex trauma, which is defined as the exposure to multiple, recurring, interpersonal traumatic events over an extended period of time. In the context of racial trauma, you can think of microaggressions, for example, as contributing to its complex nature. Microaggressions are small racist acts that occur in everyday situations, which create feelings of anxiety, stress, and uncertainty for the person receiving it. Microaggressions can reinforce stereotypes, power differentials, inequitable social norms, and, over time, cause an individual to be traumatized. Now, a word on how racism causes trauma from Dr. Monica Williams, who is doing important work around racial trauma and psychedelics.
So this is how racism causes trauma. These racist incidents need to be understood as traumatic. They affect survivors in ways that are analogous to the effect that rape and domestic violence have on their victims. Because the act is a violation of an individual's personhood, the person feels disempowered or powerless. The events are unpredictable and uncontrollable, which is a recipe for anxiety. And then when someone tries to call attention to it, well, then they may be challenged, ridiculed, or dismissed by others. And so the recurring violence of microaggressions can be thought of as similar to bullying or sexual harassment. And in fact, research shows that subtle acts can be as bad as overt acts.
Now, what are some symptoms of racial trauma? According to the VA, racial trauma symptoms are similar to that of PTSD and can include having unwanted memories, avoiding thoughts, feelings, and reminders of racial trauma. In addition, racial trauma can lead to negative thoughts about oneself, others, and the world, and contribute to negative moods. Finally, people may feel on guard and on high alert and have trouble with concentration, sleep, or irritability due to racial trauma. Additional symptoms may include anxiety and fear, guilt or shame, dissociation, disconnectedness, social isolation, anger, rumination, difficulty trusting others, feeling stigmatized or ostracized, hypervigilance, headaches, chest pains, nausea, fatigue, and depression. Now, let's see how trauma impacts the brain. There are 3 key areas involved: the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for rational thinking and executive functioning, which includes things like emotion regulation, mental flexibility, and self-control. Trauma causes the prefrontal cortex to shrink. Next up is the hippocampus, which is our memory center and is responsible for helping us differentiate between the past and the present. Trauma also causes this part of the brain to shrink, meaning that there may be errors in encoding memories and potential to relive memories. Lastly, the amygdala is responsible for threat and danger protection, and it tends to become overly active in response to trauma. The amygdala suppresses functioning in the rationalization parts of the brain, making it more difficult to think rationally over time. You're more likely to go into fight, flight, or freeze states because of your amygdala. Now that we have some background on what racial trauma is and how it affects the brain, let's think about potential treatments. A potential useful treatment model comes from a book entitled The Cost of Racism for People of Color, Contextualizing Experiences of Discrimination. Chapter 11 of this book details what racial trauma recovery may look like. The chapter notes that clinical treatment modalities that address race-related wounds and racial trauma need to expand their clinical focus to include clients' spiritual beliefs, meaning-making process, context, and socio-political factors. I'd like to share an excerpt from this chapter, which highlights key features of what the recovery process and treatment of racial trauma may look like. A race-informed approach to racial victimization is holistic, and thus it integrates culturally adapted mainstream therapies, ethnic healing systems, and liberation psychology. A central focus in this approach is the empowerment of survivors to voice their reality, perceive themselves as a source of authority, and develop critical consciousness to transform themselves and their circumstances. More specifically, the race-informed treatment phases include A. Assessment and stabilization, B. Desensitization, C. Reprocessing, D. Psychological decolonization, and E. Social action. Here's a quick chart that breaks down the phases of race-informed treatment, and if you'd like to learn more, I strongly recommend checking out this chapter for yourself. I think it's important that this approach centers, again, the empowerment of survivors to voice their own lived reality, to perceive themselves as a source of authority, and to develop critical consciousness to transform themselves and their circumstances. The more that I think about this, the more that I'm convinced that psychedelics can be helpful with racial trauma. Psychedelics can come in many forms, like psilocybin, ketamine, and MDMA. You may recognize some of their other names like magic mushrooms, K, and Molly. But generally, psychedelics are psychoactive substances that can produce effects on the body and mind. We're actually in the middle of a psychedelic renaissance right now because there's a lot of new research being done which indicates that psychedelic drugs may be useful in treating mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, trauma, end-of-life distress, and substance use disorder. Something that's important to note is that indigenous cultures have been using psychedelics as medicines for many years, and it's not something new to treat ailments with such. But you may be wondering, what does this have to do with racial trauma? Well, in addition to having therapeutic benefits for those struggling with mental health issues, psychedelics can facilitate spiritual and personal growth, which can be helpful when aiming to heal from racial discrimination. Furthermore, using psychedelics can increase feelings of connectedness, compassion, and openness, which may also be helpful when working to process and heal from a racially traumatic experience. Up until now, not much work has been done incorporating BIPOC individuals into the psychedelic space. But Dr. Monica Williams has been at the forefront of closing the gap between racial trauma and psychedelics. One of her studies has been the first to explore how mental health symptoms among BIPOC individuals who experience racial trauma can change after using psychedelics in a non-clinical setting. Regarding the study's findings, overall, participants in the study reported reductions from before to after the memorable psychedelic experience, and all symptoms assessed. There was a notable decrease in traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety. Notably, the respondents for this study took psychedelics in a non-clinical setting, and yet the results were very promising regarding mental health implications for BIPOC individuals. After reading the study, I wondered what their results would have been had the respondents taken psychedelics in a clinical setting. What do I mean by this? Well, I'm referring to psychedelic-assisted therapy, which combines the use of psychedelics with psychotherapy. Essentially, you have a few sessions of talk therapy with a therapist, then a dosing session in which you take the psychedelic, and then you have follow-up sessions in which you work with a therapist to integrate what you experienced while on the drug. In another study conducted by Monica Williams and colleagues, researchers aimed to capture the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy experiences of 3 Black women who were also therapists in the psychedelic therapy space. Here are bits from one of the therapists' experiences. "I feel like I'm dying, but it's okay," I say with a smile on my face. As I lie on the couch with 2 therapists by my side, I observe a battle between my mind and body. My body ready to speak, each cell becoming more energized and attuned to the drug, ready for a deeper knowing of what it means to be human. And my mind, stuck, repetitive, looping on narratives of the past, making sure that I keep it together on my journey. Soon enough, the drug sneaks past my mind's defenses, past my reflexive tendency towards control and precision, and catapults me to a place of dissolution. Defenses down, I am raw and open, experiencing the world in its divine essence. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Me, a young Black woman, free. I had transcended the political realities of my race and gender and ascended to something greater. I got to be human. When working with people who have experienced racial trauma, it's important for therapists to utilize modalities that empower the individual to reclaim ownership over the narrative of their life. Internal family systems, or IFS, is one such modality. Here's a super brief explanation of IFS. IFS is a therapy model in which the mind is viewed as being composed of multiple parts. Emotions, thoughts, and sensations can all manifest as parts within us. Through IFS, we can create a safe space to get to know parts and potentially form new narratives around their roles in our lives. Here are a few reasons why I think IFS can be a helpful modality to utilize in psychedelic-assisted therapy while aiming to treat racial trauma. First, a primary goal of IFS is the cultivation of self-leadership, or the degree to which one is led by virtues such as compassion, calm, clarity, connectedness, and confidence. Self-leadership involves radical, all-encompassing self-compassion and a release of one's burdens. I found a study that explored the relationships between self-leadership, racial identity, attitudes, race-related stress, and mental health outcomes among Black college students. The study found that self-leadership negatively predicted depression and anxiety. Now, another component of IFS, which can be useful in treating racial trauma, is that of burdens. Here's Dick Swartz, the creator of IFS, explaining how racism is a burden for BIPOC individuals.
Legacy can also be a burden. As it relates to racism, how is that the case? How is racism a legacy and then a burden?
Yeah, so as I started working with what we call parts, which are these little minds that, so it's not just double mind, but people have lots of different parts, it seems. what I found was a lot of the extreme ones are driven by what we call burdens, which are extreme beliefs and emotions that came into your system from some kind of a trauma or from bad parenting or something like that, and attach to these parts and drive them almost like a virus, like the COVID virus. And at first I just worked with what we call personal burdens, which are what I just described. But as I continued, it became clear that some of these extreme beliefs and emotions didn't come from your lifetime, but in fact had been passed down the generations, either in your family or your ethnic group, or just are floating around in our culture that you absorb, racism being one of those.
So, we talked about many things today. We talked about the ties between racial trauma, qualities of approaches to treat such. We talked about psychedelics, psychedelic-assisted therapy, and how IFS may be a modality to treat racial trauma. I worked on this video as a project for a class. To share a bit about me, I am currently a master's student studying to become a clinical social worker, and I do psychedelic-assisted therapy along with regular psychotherapy with my clients. I'm still learning, and I created this video as a form of psychoeducation for the people interested in this topic. Let me know what you think by leaving a comment below, and thank you for watching.